Have you ever considered that some places don't become symbols? They arrive as one? Long before anyone imagined iron bars, guard towers, or inmate numbers, a raw slab of sandstone forced its way into the icy churn of the bay, as if it had been placed there deliberately. No soil is worth farming, no fresh water to sustain life, just wind, sharp, unrelenting, and currents cold enough to turn escape into myth. Nature didn't overlook this place. It stripped it down to a single function: separation. That place is Alcatraz Island, later branded The Rock, but long before the name, it had already mastered the role. To understand Alcatraz is to trace the architecture of exclusion itself, not the kind built with concrete and contracts, but the kind that evolves with human fear, control, and order. It began as a site of spiritual exile, where isolation wasn't just physical, it was existential. Then it hardened into a military outpost, a defensive nerve point watching over a growing nation. And eventually it became something colder, more deliberate. A federal holding ground for men society had decided could not be corrected, only contained. Alcatraz didn't change its nature over time. It didn't need to. The world simply kept finding new reasons to use it, exactly as it was always meant to be. Long before European ships cut through the fog of the bay, the island had already earned its reputation, and not in any written record, but in memory, in warning, in story. For the Miwok and Ohlone peoples, the island wasn't just a resource, it was a threshold. Yes, it offered bird eggs and the occasional marine catch, but that wasn't what defined it. What defined it was distance, finality, the kind of separation that carried consequences beyond the physical. Oral traditions suggest that this was where individuals who violated the deepest social codes were sent, not punished in the conventional sense, but removed, exiled. The island functioned less like a prison and more like a social severance, a place where presence itself became a sentence. The Miwok, in particular, believed the island was inhabited by malevolent forces. That belief wasn't arbitrary. Isolation distorts perception. A barren outcrop surrounded by freezing, restless water, stripped of comfort and community, doesn't need spirits to feel haunted. It produces its own. The fear was environmental, psychological, and cultural all at once. And just like that, the pattern was set. Long before iron bars and federal authority, Alcatraz Island had already been assigned its role, a place where society sends what it no longer wants to hold. When Juan Manuel de Ayala sailed into the bay in 1775, he gave it a name, La Isla de los Alcatrazes, Island of the Pelicans, a nod to the heavy colonies of brown pelicans crowding its cliffs. It was an observational name, almost indifferent. But names don't define places. Patterns do. And by then, Alcatraz had already been practicing its purpose for centuries. When the United States took control of California and gold began to pour out of it, the bay stopped being just a body of water. It became an asset that needed protection, fast, strategic, absolute. In 1850, Millard Fillmore made a decision that would formalize what the island had always implied. It was too valuable and too isolated to be left unused. Alcatraz Island was reserved for military purposes, and by the time of the American Civil War, it had transformed into the most heavily fortified position on the West Coast. Its perimeter lined with cannons, its purpose unmistakable: guard the gold, control the bay, deter everything. But something quieter was happening beneath the artillery. The same elements that made it an impenetrable fortress, those violent currents, that geographic finality, were far more suited to a different kind of control. Not defense against external threats, but containment of internal ones. So the transition didn't require reinvention, it required recognition. Between 1861 and 1865, the island began holding Confederate sympathizers and privateers, early indicators that its function was shifting from protection to confinement. By 1895, 19 Hopi men, members of the Hopi, were sent there for resisting federal land policies. This wasn't about crime in the conventional sense. It was about compliance, about enforcing a system that had no tolerance for resistance. Then came World War I, and with it, a new category of inmate, the conscientious objector. Men like Philip Grosser didn't just serve time, they documented it. What they revealed was less about physical punishment and more about psychological engineering. Isolation, silence, the early mechanics of sensory deprivation. By 1933, the country had a new problem. Organized crime operating at a scale the existing prison system couldn't manage. The military stepped aside. Control of the island shifted to the United States Department of Justice, and with that, Alcatraz entered its most infamous phase. This wasn't just another prison project. Under the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the island was redesigned with intent, precision-built to break patterns of defiance. Director Sanford Bates and Warden James A. Johnston didn't just upgrade the facility. They engineered an environment. The mandate was clear: maximum security, minimum privilege. Steel replaced vulnerability, tool-proof bars, reinforced perimeters, controlled movement. The prison was divided into 4 blocks, each calibrated for surveillance and restriction. A standard cell measured roughly 5 by 9 feet, barely larger than a mattress. Inside, a cot, a cold water sink, a toilet, and a small shelf. Nothing excessive, nothing humanizing. But the real design wasn't in the materials, it was in the control of interaction. Guards operated from elevated gun galleries, enclosed walkways that allowed them to monitor inmates without ever sharing space with them. Contact wasn't just minimized, it was engineered out of the system. Authority existed above, unseen but constant. Even communal spaces weren't exempt. In the dining hall, tear gas canisters were embedded directly into the ceiling, wired for remote activation. A riot didn't need to escalate. It could be neutralized instantly, without warning, without negotiation. This was not architecture meant to house people. It was architecture designed to suppress behavior, predict it, limit it, and, if necessary, erase it. By the time Alcatraz reached this stage, it had completed its evolution. Not from one function to another, but from instinct to system. What began as a place people feared had become a place the state could calculate. Alcatraz was never built for volume. At its peak, Alcatraz Island held barely 260 men. Not because capacity was limited, but because purpose was selective. This wasn't a correctional facility, it was a filtration system. If you landed here, it meant other prisons had already failed to contain you, behaviorally, psychologically, or symbolically. You weren't just dangerous, you were disruptive to the system itself, and the roster reflected that precision. Al Capone arrived in 1934 with a reputation that had once bent entire cities. Inside Alcatraz, that reputation had no currency. The structure dismantled his influence piece by piece, and his untreated syphilis accelerated the collapse. George "Machine Gun" Kelly, a man whose nickname alone carried myth, became something unexpected. Compliant, 17 years without incident. Then there was Robert Stroud, immortalized as the Birdman. The myth suggests companionship, fragility, a man softened by birds. The reality was harsher. He spent most of his time in isolation, at the D Block and the prison hospital, and was never allowed to keep birds on the island. Even his legend had to be corrected. Alvin Karpis stayed longer than anyone else. Longevity, in this context, wasn't survival. It was endurance, a prolonged exposure to a system designed to erode resistance over time. Inside Alcatraz, hierarchy didn't follow prison logic. It followed external identity and internal resilience. Who you had been mattered, but only until the environment started working on you. After that, the real metric was simple. How long could you hold yourself together? because the system wasn't built around violence. It was built around pressure. The philosophy was stripped to 4 non-negotiables: food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else, work assignments, communication, and visitation, existed as conditional privileges. This wasn't deprivation in the crude sense. It was controlled scarcity. Autonomy wasn't removed all at once. It was rationed, measured, and withheld with precision. The day began at 6:30 a.m. It ended in practical terms at 4:50 p.m., when enforced silence took over. Not quiet. Silence. The kind that doesn't just limit speech, but reshapes thought. And then there was the paradox that defined the system's psychological sophistication: food. Warden James A. Johnston understood something fundamental, that discontent scales quickly in confined populations. His solution wasn't leniency, it was a strategy. Meals at Alcatraz were among the best in the federal system: roast beef, gravy, fresh bread, and even pumpkin pie during holidays. It wasn't generosity, it was stabilization. But even that came with control embedded in it. The rule was absolute: take all you want, eat everything you take. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable. Even consumption became a regulated behavior. And for those who tested the system beyond its limits, there was D block. Specifically, the hole. No light, no clothing, no meaningful human contact. Just a body, a mind, and time stretched to its most punishing form. Inmates could be held there for up to 19 days. The environment did what force couldn't. It dismantled cognitive stability. Accounts describe a slow fragmentation where identity begins to blur and reality becomes unreliable. In that state, even the distant sound of a foghorn became an anchor, proof that the outside world still existed. If Alcatraz had a breaking point, it didn't arrive as collapse, it surfaced as defiance. Despite total control, resistance never disappeared. 14 escape attempts were recorded. Most dissolved into silence. 2 didn't. In 1946, the Battle of Alcatraz exposed a crack in the system. Bernard Coy seized the gun gallery, an almost impossible breach. But the plan failed on a single oversight: the missing key to the recreation yard. That moment triggered chaos. Hostages taken, gunfire unleashed, a 48-hour standoff that ended only when the United States Marine Corps stormed the prison with grenades. Control was restored, but the illusion of invulnerability was not. Then came 1962 with the quiet disruption. Frank Morris and brothers John Anglin and Clarence Anglin didn't fight the system, they studied it. For months, they carved through concrete with improvised tools, built a raft from raincoats, and staged their disappearance with lifelike dummy heads. The Federal Bureau of Investigation ruled it a drowning. The case never closed. That ambiguity lingers, feeding larger questions about secrecy within the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and whether isolation in places like D Block echoed early psychological experiments later associated with Project MKUltra. No proof, only pattern. By 1963, Alcatraz wasn't defeated by men, but by environment. Corrosion outpaced control, steel failed, costs rose. The island closed from exhaustion. But Alcatraz wasn't finished. It was resetting. In 1969, a different kind of occupation began, one that didn't rely on force, but on presence. The Indians of all tribes arrived, not as prisoners, but as claimants. Their message was deliberate. If the federal government could declare land surplus, then by its own logic, it could be reclaimed. For 19 months, they built something the island had never held before: a functioning community, a school, a radio station, a voice. This wasn't confinement, it was reclamation, and it worked. The occupation didn't just draw attention, it forced a recalibration of federal policy, accelerating a shift toward Native American self-determination. For the first time in its recorded history, Alcatraz wasn't being used to exclude people. It was being used to amplify them. Today, the island operates under the stewardship of the National Park Service, a preserved landmark, a controlled narrative, a destination. The pelicans have returned, reclaiming the cliffs just as they did before any system, before any structure. On the surface, it has come full circle. But places like this don't reset cleanly. Visitors still report things they can't quite explain. Phantom banjo music drifting through empty corridors. Sudden drops in temperature inside cell 14D. Whether those experiences are psychological residue or something less definable is almost beside the point. Alcatraz doesn't need ghosts to feel inhabited. Its history does that on its own. Because what remains here isn't just architecture, it's imprint. Every phase of the island's existence leaves behind the same underlying question. What happens when you try to contain something that resists containment? Not just bodies, but identity, will, and belief. The answer is written into every chapter. Some men tried to outswim it, some tried to outthink it. Others endured it until endurance became its own form of resistance. And eventually, a group arrived and rewrote the entire premise, not by escaping the island, but by redefining what it meant to be there. That's the contradiction at the center of Alcatraz. It was built to silence. It produced stories. It was designed to isolate. It created movements. It enforced limits. It provoked defiance. And in the end, it proves something the system never quite managed to eliminate. Confinement can restrict space, but it cannot fully extinguish the instinct to break beyond it, whether through rebellion, reinvention, or sheer refusal to disappear.